Alaska is a land where natural beauty coexists with the abyss, and beyond every horizon lies something that humans cannot explain. Here, among mountain ranges, permafrost, and icy rivers, people disappear as if they had never been there. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, no answers to the main question: what happened to them? Official reports dryly attribute these disappearances to accidents, storms, or wild animals, but locals whisper otherwise. They say that something lives in these lands that does not obey the laws we know. Today, we will tell you about 3 disappearances, each of which defies logic and common sense. These stories have it all: unexplained findings, a complete lack of traces, and details that will send shivers down your spine. We begin in January 1992, when experienced trapper Leslie Jonathan set out on his usual 3-day route along the frozen Delta Creek and was never seen again. January 28, 1992. Alaska Range, Hayes Pass area. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The temperature hovers around minus 14.8 degrees Fahrenheit. For Leslie Jonathan, this wasn't a job, it was a way of life. At 45, he was a trapper through and through, one of the few who still lived by the old ways of Alaska. He wasn't a tourist or a government employee in uniform. He was a trapper whose family had been doing this for generations. These mountains and rivers were his home. He could read tracks like others read books, predict the weather by the color of the sky, and knew the habits of every animal in the area. That morning, he set out on his usual 3-day route along the trails to check his traps for marten and beaver along the frozen Delta Creek. He had done this hundreds of times. He had a team of 6 strong, proven Malamutes, a sled loaded with everything he needed, and his old Marlin .336 caliber rifle. Not for protection, but as a working tool. He had an agreement with the Park Service station to check in on the radio every few days just to let them know he was okay. It wasn't a requirement, but a precaution taken by all the local winterers. He was supposed to check in on the evening of January 30th, but the radio was silent. He was silent on the 31st, and on February 1st. At first, there was no panic. These things happen in Alaska. Blizzards, radio malfunctions. But Jonathan was known for his incredible sense of responsibility. If he could get in touch, he would. By February 3rd, his closest neighbor, who lived 50 miles away, and the Park Service coordinator realized that something was wrong. On February 4th, after 2 days of no response on the radio, a National Guard helicopter was sent to fly his presumed route. Searching from the air in such conditions is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Endless white plains, cliffs, dense fir forests. The pilot and observer scanned the area for hours. Then, closer to noon, they spotted it. A dark spot on the dazzling white blanket of the frozen valley through which Delta Creek meandered. As the helicopter descended, the scene that met their eyes defied logical explanation. It was Jonathan's sled. It stood right in the middle of a vast, open, icy space. 6 dogs, still harnessed, lay huddled together in the snow. They were alive but looked exhausted and frightened. The helicopter landed at a distance, and 2 rescuers made their way to the sled. There was not a single human footprint within dozens of feet of the sled and dogs. Not one. The snow was pristine, except for the dogs' paw prints and the sled runners, which led here and then broke off. It looked as if Leslie Jonathan had vanished from the sled. A closer look raised more questions than it answered. The sled was fully equipped. Food supplies, fuel for the burner, a sleeping bag, a tent. Everything was in place, neatly tied down. His rifle was in a case strapped to the sled. Later, an examination would confirm that the magazine was full and there was no bullet in the chamber. The weapon had not been used. His thermos with cold tea was lying on the sled. There were no signs of a struggle, no disorder. The dogs, although frightened, had no injuries. They were hungry and thirsty, but unharmed. It seemed as if their owner had gotten up and vanished into thin air. A ground search operation began. A team of trappers like Jonathan and several rangers combed the area square by square. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. The leading theory was that he had fallen through the ice. But engineers who arrived at the scene drilled through the ice for several miles. It was more than 3 feet thick, with no cracks or holes. That theory was ruled out. Then they suggested a sudden heart attack or other medical problem. But even in that case, the man would have fallen off the sled, leaving a trail. He couldn't have just disappeared. The strangest detail was the dogs. The lead dog, named Kai, was known for his calm and confident temperament. Rescuers found him cowering under the sled, whimpering and growling at anyone who tried to approach him. All the dogs showed signs of extreme stress. Something had frightened them very severely. On the 3rd day of the search, one of the trackers, an Athabascan Indian named Joe Whitehorse, strayed almost a mile west of the group's main route toward a wooded slope. What he found there changed the course of the entire investigation and turned it from a rescue operation into something completely different. These were not tracks. Instead, there were deep furrows in the snow. They were spaced unevenly and unlike anything they had seen before. They were not bear tracks. Grizzlies hibernate at this time of year. They weren't wolf or wolverine tracks either. The grooves were long, narrow, and dug up to 12 inches deep into the snow. It was as if someone had pierced the snow with something long and hard, like crutches. But these crutches left too narrow an imprint. And there weren't just 2, but sometimes 3 or 4 in a group, as if the creature was leaning on several limbs at once. Joe followed this strange chain of dents. It led up the slope into a thick spruce forest. After a few hundred feet, he found Jonathan's first item, his heavy parka. It hadn't been taken off neatly. It had been torn at the seams on the back and shoulders, as if it had been pulled off with incredible force without being unbuttoned. There wasn't a drop of blood on the fabric, just roughly torn clothing thrown onto the snow. It was becoming evident that Leslie hadn't left of his own accord. The group moved on along the trail. The atmosphere was tense. People walked in silence, gripping their weapons tightly. Strange tracks led them deeper into the forest, and here they began to find other things. A snowshoe broken in half, which had been attached to Jonathan's backpack. A lighter had fallen out of a pocket. And then they saw blood, a few drops on the snow, and next to them was something that made even the most experienced hunters fall silent. It was a fang, huge, yellowish, about 4 inches long, curved like a dagger. It did not belong to any known predator in North America. It was too thin for a bear and utterly different in shape from a wolf or cougar. It just lay there in the snow, next to the drops of blood that analysis later confirmed belonged to Leslie Jonathan. The search was called off at dusk that day. The next day, the operation headquarters received orders from Anchorage. All volunteers and local hunters were ordered to leave the area. A special team arrived, not from the Park Service. These people were dressed in military gear, kept to themselves, and did not talk to anyone. The official reason was increased avalanche danger and difficult weather conditions. Although the weather was clear, the search was called off after 2 days. Leslie Jonathan was never found. The official conclusion was missing, presumed dead, as a result of an accident in the wild. There was no mention of strange tracks, torn parkas, or a fang found in the final report. The case was closed. We will probably never know what happened to Leslie Jonathan. His name joined the long list of those who disappeared without a trace in the wilds of Alaska. But the story of his disappearance is not just a tragedy. It is a chilling reminder that in the wildest and most untouched corners of our planet, there may be life forms that do not fit into our understanding of biology. Predators that have evolved in complete isolation and for whom humans are nothing more than prey. And sometimes when humans venture too far, they risk encountering what lies waiting in the permafrost. September 8, 1987, Olympic National Park, Washington State. A vast, wild area where temperate rainforest meets rocky peaks. The day was clear and warm for early fall, perfect conditions for working outdoors. Martin Kraus, a 31-year-old assistant ranger, was precisely the kind of person you'd want to see on a job like this. He was in great shape, meticulous, methodical, and knew these trails like the back of his hand. He wasn't a novice or an adventurer. This was his profession, and he took it very seriously. His task for the day was completely routine, even dull. Check a few abandoned huts and old miners' shacks in the Snowhook Trail area. It was standard procedure before the rainy season began. Make sure the buildings weren't occupied by squatters, damaged by vandals, or dangerous to hikers who might stray off the trail. He took a light backpack with water, food for the day, a first aid kit, and his small transistor radio. He often listened to it during stops to break the silence of the forest. Before leaving, as always, he left a note in his journal. He indicated his exact route, listed the huts he planned to visit, and indicated his estimated time of return, around 8 p.m., that is, in 12 hours. He set off on his route, and no one saw him again. He did not return that evening. At first, no one raised the alarm. In such terrain, a delay of a couple of hours was not unusual. Perhaps he had stumbled upon a fallen tree and had to find a way around it. Or maybe he had been delayed while writing a report on one of the huts. But when he did not appear by the next morning and his radio remained silent, the senior ranger sounded the alarm. 24 hours passed. By noon, when 36 hours had elapsed, a full-scale search operation was underway. Dozens of rangers, volunteers, and several canine units participated in the search. The searchers were confident they would find him quickly. The weather was good. Kraus was an experienced professional, and if something had happened to him, an injury, a fall, he should have been somewhere near the trail. But the first day of searching yielded nothing, neither did the second. The dogs lost their trail about 2 miles from the trailhead. They just lost him. There were no diverging tracks, indicating that he had strayed from the route. His scent disappeared in one place as if he had dissolved into thin air. On the 4th day of the search, September 12th, one of the groups was combing through the thick undergrowth north of the trail. One of the volunteers happened to look up and saw something that didn't belong in the forest. About 65 feet from the trail, at a height of about 7 feet, Kraus's radio was hanging from a smooth, sturdy branch of a Douglas fir tree. The discovery immediately raised a lot of questions. The radio was hanging from its leather strap, which was neatly slung over the branch. It hadn't been thrown there. If it had, it would most likely have fallen or caught on something. It had been hung there deliberately. The branch was too high to reach while standing on the ground. You would have had to jump or climb something. But the strangest thing was what was under the tree, or rather what wasn't there. The ground under the tree, a thick layer of moss, ferns, and fallen pine needles, was untouched. Not a single footprint, not a broken twig, not a flattened patch of moss. There was no sign that anyone had stood there trying to reach the branch. No tracks were leading to the tree from the trail, or from the tree into the forest. It was physically impossible. To hang a radio, a person would have had to leave some trace. But there were none. The search immediately concentrated within a few miles of the tree. Rangers combed every ravine, every stream, every rock ledge. They found nothing. No backpack, no clothes, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Investigators began working through theories, each of which led to a dead end. A wild animal attack? Impossible. A bear or a cougar would have left tracks, blood, and torn clothing. And they certainly wouldn't have hung a radio on a tree branch. Robbery or murder? Kraus had no enemies, and again there were no signs of a struggle. Why would the attacker take all his belongings but leave the radio behind, and in such a conspicuous manner? An accident? If he had fallen and injured himself, he would have been found. He couldn't have gotten far from where he left the radio. Voluntary disappearance? Martin was married, had a stable life, and loved his job. He had no reason to drop everything and go. And even if we assume that this was the case, the act with the radio receiver seems like a meaningless, symbolic gesture that does not fit into the logic of an escape. Gradually, the focus shifted to Kraus's psychological state. His colleagues described him as a completely stable and well-balanced person. However, one of his close friends later mentioned that Martin had become a little more withdrawn in the weeks before his disappearance. The searchers reached the huts he was supposed to check. The first 4 were fine, empty, and untouched. But in the last, most remote hut, they discovered something strange. On the dusty wooden floor, someone had laid out several small, perfectly symmetrical spirals made of small river stones. It did not look like a child's game or a ritual. It was a methodical, precise, and utterly meaningless process. There was no evidence that Kraus had done this, but there were no other signs of human presence in the hut. This gave rise to the most disturbing theory: a sudden and acute psychotic breakdown. Could Martin Krause, for some unknown reason, have lost touch with reality in the middle of his journey? Could he have entered the hut himself, spent hours laying out these spirals, and then, upon leaving, committed one last meaningful but irrational act, hanging his radio on a branch as a farewell gesture, before disappearing into the thickest part of the forest, never to return? This version is scarier than any predator or murderer. It suggests that the greatest danger to humans in the wild is not what lurks outside, but what can suddenly break inside. The active search was called off after 2 weeks when the autumn rains began, washing away any hypothetical traces that might have remained. Martin Krause was never found. 7 years later, he was officially declared dead. The case was closed. Nothing remained of him except the silent artifact, a radio that hung in a tree for several days before being taken down and placed in a box with other evidence. Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska in July is a sight that is difficult to describe in words. Bright blue ice, emerald green grass peeking through the rocks, and deafening silence, broken only by the crackling of the glacier and the cries of birds. Exit Glacier is the most accessible part of this icy world. Several well-equipped trails lead to it, which are used by hundreds of people every day. This is not a dense taiga, but a popular tourist route. That is why what happened on July 15, 2001 seems so impossible. Andrew Kane was not a typical teenager. Quiet and thoughtful, he was obsessed with photography. While his peers were into sports or video games, Andrew was saving up for new lenses for his Canon EOS Rebel 2000 film camera. A trip to Alaska with his family was his dream. He could sit in one spot for hours, waiting for the right light to get that perfect shot. On that day, the Keene family joined a small tour group for a hike to a viewpoint near the Exit Glacier. The route was moderately difficult, about 3 miles one way. Following standard procedure, the guide split the group into pairs so that no one would get lost. Andrew's partner was another teenager, 16-year-old Kevin Richardson. At first, everything went as usual. The group slowly made its way up the trail. Andrew stopped frequently to take pictures, but quickly caught up with the others. Kevin, his partner, later told investigators that they hardly spoke. Andrew was wholly absorbed in what he was doing. About halfway to the summit, the trail curves, offering an awe-inspiring view of the ice field. The sun came out from behind the clouds, and the light reflecting off the glacier created a stunning scene. It was at that moment that Andrew stopped. According to Kevin, he raised his camera and said the last words anyone ever heard him utter. "Wow, go on, I'll catch up in a minute." Kevin nodded and continued, catching up with the group, which was only 100 feet ahead. He didn't see anything dangerous about it. They were on a wide, well-marked trail. There were other tourists around. What could happen in a minute? The minute stretched into 5. When the leading group reached a small rest area, Kevin looked back. Andrew was not on the trail. He figured he was still taking pictures, or maybe had decided to turn back. He reported this to the guide, but he didn't think much of it either, assuming the guy had just gotten carried away and would show up soon. But he didn't show up. When it became clear 20 minutes later that Andrew was missing, the guide sent one of his assistants down the trail. He reached the start of the route, but Andrew was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in. The group descended, shouting his name. There was no response. By evening, the National Park Service launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. The first 48 hours are the most critical for finding a missing person. All available resources were deployed in the operation. Dozens of rescuers on foot, rangers, volunteers, a helicopter with a thermal imager, and several dog teams. They were sure it was a standard case. Most likely the teenager had twisted his ankle while stepping off the trail or got lost in the thick alder thickets that grew along the edges of the route. But the search yielded nothing. The dogs picked up Andrew's scent on the trail, leading them right to the spot where Kevin had last seen him, and then nothing. The trail ended. It didn't go to the right or the left, it just disappeared, as if Andrew had vanished into thin air at that point. Rescuers combed every inch of the area around that spot. No signs of a struggle, no signs of a fall from the slope, not a single item of clothing. Nothing. By the end of the second day, hopes of finding Andrew alive were beginning to fade. The weather was deteriorating, and cold rain fell during the night. Then, on the third day, the search party, checking a rocky moraine, a pile of boulders left behind by a glacier, about half a mile from the trail, made their first discovery. And this discovery did not clarify the situation, but only confused it to the utmost. It was Andrew's shirt, the bright red and blue flannel shirt he had been wearing that day. But it wasn't just lying on the ground. It had been neatly spread out and weighed down by 3 huge granite boulders. The search team leader, experienced ranger David Rask, later described this in his report as highly unusual. The stones were hefty. Each was estimated to weigh between 40 and 60 kilograms. One person, let alone a 17-year-old teenager, could not have lifted them and placed them neatly on the shirt by himself. This would have required the effort of at least 2 adult men or the use of some lever, but there were no traces of such a device nearby. The shirt itself was not torn or stained with blood. It was pressed into the ground under the enormous weight. It did not look like an accident, but rather a deliberate act. Someone wanted this shirt to be found, but went to inhuman lengths to secure it. It made no sense. It was like some ritual or message written in a language no one understood. The discovery was shocking. Now the leading theory was kidnapping and murder. The FBI joined the investigation. Agents began re-interviewing everyone who had been on the trail that day. But all the hikers in Andrew's group had alibis, and their statements matched. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had seen Andrew talking to anyone. The next day, the 4th day of the search, another group made a second, even stranger discovery. About half a mile from where the shirt was found, in a completely different direction, at the edge of a glacial stream, Andrew's boots were lying on the ground. Heavy hiking boots, as if someone had thrown them on the ground. There were no footprints around them, no bare feet, no other footprints. The ground was wet and any footprints would have been visible, but there were none. The 2 discoveries, made just 1 day apart, not only failed to help the investigation, but also brought it to a complete standstill. Imagine the scene. A guy's shirt found under heavy rocks in one place, and half a mile away, on the other side, his boots. Between these 2 points was rough terrain, thick brush, sharp rocks, and icy streams. The idea that Andrew had taken off his shirt himself, weighed it down with boulders, and then walked half a mile barefoot across this terrain to take off his boots and disappear seemed absurd. FBI investigators and park rangers were faced with a puzzle that had no solution. Let's examine the main theories and why none of them are effective. Theory 1, accident. This was the first and most obvious theory, but the findings disproved it. A person in distress, for example someone who fell and was injured, would not waste energy hiding their clothes under rocks and neatly arranging their shoes. In addition, their body or backpack would have been somewhere nearby. But a thorough search of the area, including crevices and bodies of water, turned up nothing. Version 2, attack by a wild animal. Black bears and grizzlies are found in Kenai Fjords National Park. A bear attack is always a brutal and bloody spectacle. It leaves behind torn clothing, blood, and apparent signs of a struggle. None of this was found. The shirt was intact. The boots were untouched. No predator is capable of such deliberate and strange manipulation of its victim's belongings. Version 3, kidnapping and murder. This version became the main one after the shirt was found under the rocks. The weight of the boulders indicated the involvement of third parties. Perhaps Andrew witnessed something illegal. Maybe he encountered criminals on the trail. But here too, the logic breaks down. Why would the killers create such a complex and bizarre still life out of the victim's belongings? Usually, criminals try to get rid of the body and evidence as quickly and discreetly as possible. They don't waste time dragging heavy stones or carefully placing shoes half a mile away from another piece of evidence. This does not hide the traces, but instead draws attention to them and creates a mystery. The Keene family had no enemies. They were an ordinary middle-class family, which ruled out kidnapping for ransom. Version 4, voluntary disappearance or suicide. Friends and family unanimously claimed that Andrew was a completely normal guy who was passionate about his hobby. He had plans for the future, including applying to college to study art. He had no history of depression or suicidal tendencies. But even if we assume a sudden mental breakdown, this does not explain the physical impossibility of moving those rocks alone. Ranger David Rusk, who led the search, said in an unofficial interview 10 years later, "In 30 years of working for the Park Service, I've seen dozens of tragedies. People fall off cliffs, drown in rivers, freeze to death in blizzards, or are killed by bears. Each of these deaths leaves a mark subject to the laws of physics. There is always logic, albeit cruel. In Kane's case, there was no logic. It felt like we were dealing with something that operated according to completely different rules that were alien to us. This wasn't just a murder, it was like some statement, but we couldn't read it." The search continued for another 2 weeks, but to no avail. Neither Andrew's backpack nor the Canon camera he used to take his last photo was ever found. This is particularly tragic. The only thing that could have shed light on the last moments of his life, the image on the film, disappeared with him. What happened? We will never know. Perhaps Andrew did encounter people, and what they did with his belongings was the result of drugs or a cruel, twisted mind. Maybe something even stranger happened beyond our comprehension. But the facts remain: a shirt buried under heavy rocks, boots standing alone half a mile away, and no trace of the man who strayed from the group for just a moment to capture the beauty of the glacier. That beauty was the last thing he ever saw. And his story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries have no answers, leaving behind only emptiness and unanswered questions. That's all, folks. The mysterious disappearances in Alaska remain unsolved, and each new story only reinforces the feeling that these lands hold secrets that are best left untold. If you found this interesting, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you find the most mysterious. There are even more creepy and inexplicable cases ahead. Don't miss them.